Well, class, you'll be glad to know that this is the last lesson in the chapter on chemical bonding and chemical reactions. Quickly, we've talked about bonding, ionic bonding, metallic bonding, covalent bonding, chemistry of carbon and how it is very good at forming covalent bonds, leading to a variety of molecules, including polymers, and we talked about a number of polymers. And I'm sure since watching the lesson on polymer, you've been looking at the bottom of all the plastic containers that you have in your apartment or dorm room and checking for that little triangle. And hopefully you've also been thinking a little bit more about recycling. We had a chapter then on phases of matter and transitions between phases. And then the last lesson was on chemical reactions, in which we talked about the driving force for chemical reactions. In this final lesson in this chapter, we're going to talk about just some important molecules. Not because of them being so important, but because each one will illustrate the relationship between the structure of the molecules and the physical and chemical properties of the substance. Now, physical properties, we're talking about things like their phase state, whether or not they conduct electricity, that sort of thing. Chemical reactivity, we're talking about whether or not the substances react with other molecules or how they react with other molecules. I'm going to start off by talking about hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are molecules made just of carbon and hydrogen. So they are among the simpler molecules in that sense. And then this is a table going from the smallest hydrocarbon, methane, which we've talked about before, methane, down to some of the larger hydrocarbons. Now these are all linear hydrocarbons because there are just thousands of different hydrocarbons I could put on this table. So these are all ones that are linear. They do not have branches, or they're not cyclic or anything complicated. The smaller ones are gases, and then as the molecules become a little bit bigger, such as pentane, hexane, heptane, octane, and of course you may recognize that the prefixes to these molecules indicate the number of carbons in the molecule. Pent for 5, hex for 6, hept for 7, oct for 8, just like octagon. The molecules become liquid. So we see the relationship between the structure of the molecule and some physical properties. As we go to even larger molecules, down to icosane, which has 20 carbons, C20, and then down to tetracantane and hexacantane, the molecules become tars or waxy, more solid-like, as you can see in the illustration on the right. So the one pattern to recognize is that as molecules become larger, they tend to become more liquid-like and then more solid-like. All of these hydrocarbons tend to react with oxygen in an oxidation reaction, or what we call a combustion reaction. So you should recognize that a number of these, like propane, is a gas that we use as a fuel for barbecuing, things of that sort. And of course, a number of petroleums, we see the names octane, which we sort of relate to gasoline. A number of these are petroleum products that we use for fuel. Also, you may have heard that oil and water don't mix. That's another example of a property. That is, water, as you may recall, is a small molecule that has polar bonds, and water then likes other molecules that have polar bonds, or other species that are charged, such as salts. But water does not like hydrocarbons because hydrocarbons do not have any polar components to the structure. And so they simply do not interact with each other very well. And that's why you've always heard that oil and water do not mix. And if you were to try to mix them, one would form a layer on top of the other. Usually the hydrocarbon would form a layer on top of the aqueous phase due to the different densities of the two. So this is one set of important molecules. Now, continuing on with this set, we find these hydrocarbons mixed together in what we call crude oil. And of course, this is an important industrial topic, so we'll talk about a little bit. How do we separate the components of crude oil? Well, this is done by a process called distillation, in which you take the crude oil and you heat it up, and the lighter components, the ones with fewer carbons, will more easily evaporate in a distillation apparatus. The lower molecular weight molecules, hydrocarbons, would be captured as gases at the top of a still such as this, and that would be those hydrocarbons. They're 1 to 4 carbons in length. Then we would capture another fraction which would have molecules with a larger number of carbons, as in this illustration 5 to 9 carbons. And then we would have the fraction that is called gasoline, where we have molecules of carbon length 5 to 10. And then on and on. As we go down, we have jet fuel or kerosene, and then diesel oil, and then finally at the bottom, the material that is so large that it does not distill at all is what we would capture as tar and use for covering our roads with asphalt. Now, besides showing the distillation process, I wanted to mention this molecule isooctane, because you hear about octane ratings of gasoline, and so the question is, what does that mean? Well, the molecule shown is actually called isooctane. That's the name of the molecule, and it turns out to be that molecule which explodes most efficiently in an internal combustion engine, leading to a smooth expansion of the piston, whereas other fractions of gasoline either explode too rapidly or too slowly, so that leads to the phenomena that we call knock. So isooctane is the basis for what we call the octane rating of gasolines. Oh, one other thing to mention before leaving this. We had the lesson on polymers, and we saw that polymers are made by small monomers reacting together in a polymerization reaction to form larger molecules. Well, it turns out that the smaller hydrocarbons that would be produced in a distillation apparatus such as this are also the precursors of a number of these polymers, as well as being used for fuel. So the point is that we have two different kinds of demands for these raw materials. Now, here are a few other molecules of interest. Ethanol, which probably no student here at the university has heard of, so I wanted to show you the structure of ethanol. Glucose, the molecule to the left, which we've talked about before. You've heard of glucose, but it's a biomolecule. Of course, ethanol is as well. And then I wanted to show you serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter that is associated with the feeling of calmness or pleasure. The point of showing you these molecules is that when we get into the area of biomolecules, there can be different biological functions, and they all are basically related to the structures of the molecules. I like showing you serotonin as well, because every time I hear the Pharrell Williams song, I think of serotonin. Here are 3 other examples of very important molecules, and we'll be talking about these in other chapters. ATP, you've probably heard of adenosine triphosphate, ATP, which is a molecule involved in metabolism in our cells. That is, we'll talk about metabolism as being a process in which we release the energy stored in fuel molecules that we consume, and we form ATP as a sort of energy intermediate molecule, which then travels to other places within our cells or between cells in our bodies to distribute that energy to other places where the energy is needed. The next molecule I show on the bottom left is hemoglobin. Now, this is a space-filling model. We're suddenly talking about very large molecules when we talk about hemoglobin or other proteins, because hemoglobin is an example of a protein. And of course, you probably know that the function of hemoglobin in our bodies is to carry and transport oxygen between our lungs and various other cells in our body. And the last structure is DNA, which you've no doubt heard about. It is the basic molecule found in our chromosomes, and the structure is a double helix. We'll talk about this in a future chapter, and we'll emphasize how the structure of DNA, in particular what we will call base pairing between A, T, and GC, carries genetic information. Structure leading to function. And here are 2 final examples, and what I say is the small differences can be extremely important. The difference between a tree and a potato chip. The top molecule is something called cellulose. Cellulose is a major component of trees, wood or cotton. And I show you in this drawing that cellulose is actually a polymer. It's a homopolymer with glucose units repeating one after the other. Now, the 2-unit segment that is shown is called cellubiose, What is important to focus on in this case is what is called a beta 1,4 linkage, between individual glucose units. Before explaining the significance of that beta 1,4 linkage, let me introduce the other polymer called starch or amylose. Starch is an energy storage molecule in plants. We have a similar molecule called glycogen, which is an energy storage molecule in animals. It also is more or less a homopolymer. I mean, there are places where it's slightly different, but it's more or less a homopolymer of glucose. And as you can see, at first glance, it looks very similar to cellulose. However, if you focus at the bond between the glucose units, the bonding is a little different. In starch, we have what is called an alpha 1,4 linkage. Going back to cellulose, cellulose has a beta 1,4 linkage. That slight difference in the way the glucose units are linked together determines whether or not we can digest the material or not. That is, we can eat potatoes because we have enzymes that can break alpha 1,4 linkages. We and other animals do not have enzymes that can break beta 1,4 linkages. So that's why we cannot digest wood. Now, the only exceptions that you may have heard about are like termites and like some cows. Actually, it is symbiotic bacteria in the digestive system of termites and ruminant animals such as cows. The bacteria have an enzyme called cellulase, which can break beta 1,4 linkages. And that's why termites and certain animals seem to be able to digest cellulose. Now, in one sense, it's probably good that we can't digest wood. Because if we could, then it would really be true that we could eat ourselves out of house and home. But the point of this example is that the molecular structure determines chemical properties. In one case, we can digest the molecule because we have enzymes that can break an alpha 1,4 linkage. But in the other case, we cannot digest cellulose because we do not have an enzyme that can break the beta 1,4 linkage. This is the end of our chapter on chemical bonding and chemical reactions. We'll now proceed to the next chapter.